The Beach Boys, and particularly Mike Love, got interested in transcendental meditation in the late 60s. Love ended up at a spiritual retreat led by Maharishi with the Beatles in 1968. So they were definitely seekers, the Beach Boys, interested in gurus at that point. But by 1968, the Beach Boys were at a low ebb. They had plenty of money after the huge success of their early career, but their recent albums weren't selling as well. Their tours were becoming less lucrative. The band leader and main songwriter Brian Wilson was suffering from a variety of mental health issues, which were likely exacerbated by ongoing drug abuse. He was struggling at this time and he had kind of dropped out. The hits had dried up. The Beach Boys were beginning to look out of step with the times. Bands like Jefferson Airplane, The Doors, Cream, and Jimi Hendrix were popular. The Beach Boys were beginning to look passe. Mike Love says, "We also remain clueless, or at least stuck in the 1950s, in our image. We had finally rid ourselves of the striped shirts, but replaced them with all white suits. Music fans wanted jambalaya, we were selling vanilla ice cream." Dennis Wilson was the drummer, the best looking guy in the band, and women were crazy for him. But by June of 1968, Dennis's marriage had broken down. Mike Love writes, "The other thing about Dennis was that his appetite for sex was insatiable. Too much was never enough." So it was completely in character for Dennis in the spring of 1968 to pick up two young women hitchhiking on Sunset Strip and to bring them back to his house. Dennis mentioned his involvement with Maharishi, and the woman said they too had a guru named Charlie. The woman didn't know who Dennis was, but they returned to Manson. He knew exactly who Dennis Wilson was. Dennis Wilson was generous, almost irresponsibly so. Booze, drugs, even cars, he would share this stuff freely with hangers on. This made him all the more appealing to Charlie Manson and his followers. Manson actually wanted to be a singer songwriter, but his efforts to break into the music industry had foundered. So when two of his girls told him that Dennis Wilson had picked them up and taken them to his house, he pounced. Dennis was all too happy to allow Manson and his girls to move in, use his charge cards, take his clothes, eat his food, even drive his Mercedes. Manson, after all, had something for Dennis, a stable of young women who catered to his every desire. Charlie Manson's blending of psychedelics, sexual servants, rock music, and new age rhetoric was too much for Dennis to resist. In the summer of 1968, Manson and his girls moved into Dennis's house and Dennis joined the family. In a few short months, Dennis swore from Maharishi to Manson, two diminutive but hypnotic figures who promised a better world for their followers. In a 1968 interview with the Record Mirror, Dennis said, "I still believe in meditation and I'm experimenting with tribal living. I live in the woods in California near Death Valley with 17 girls." Of course, Charlie and the family were taking advantage of Dennis, and by the end of the summer, he estimated that the family had cost him over $100,000, and even for him, that was too much. Mike Love writes, "Dennis vacated the premises, the house was leased, and when the lease expired, the owners kicked out the squatters. Manson decamped to Span Ranch outside of Los Angeles, but continued his association with Dennis, whom he still needed to launch his career. And Dennis, through some combination of loyalty and gullibility, continued to visit Manson with producers in tow." May 69, so about a year after the start of Wilson's association with the family. Love writes, "Around that time, Dennis's illusions about Manson finally ended when he paid a visit to Span Ranch. Upon his return, Dennis stopped by Brian's house, where I was working in the studio. Dennis was visibly shaken, and I asked what was wrong. I just saw Charlie take his M16 and blow this black cat in half and stuff him down the well, he said, referring to a black man. Dennis was too frightened to go to the police. Also in 1969, Dennis had introduced Manson to a successful producer called Terry Melcher. Perhaps as a favor to Dennis, Melcher went to Span Ranch twice in the late spring of 1969 to hear Manson sing. Terry was Manson's last hope, but he was unimpressed and had to tell Manson that he couldn't help him, effectively ending Manson's musical ambitions. At this time, Melcher lived at a rented house on Cielo Drive. Terry Melcher was the only son of Doris Day. He told his mother about Manson and the family, basically that they were drugged out, volatile, and potentially violent, and that they knew where he lived. So Doris insisted that Terry move out of the house on Cielo Drive. The next occupants of that house were Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate. Manson convinced his followers that the apocalypse was coming in a bloody race war, at the end of which he and his disciples would take over. All of this was prophesied, Manson said, in the White Album, in the very songs that were written by the Beatles in Rishikesh. Invoking one of those numbers, Manson called the race war Helter Skelter. 4 members of Manson's family entered the house late at night on August 9th. Manson had ordered them to murder all who were there, and they killed 5 people, including Tate, who was 8 months pregnant. The case broke 3 months later when the Manson family members were picked up for stealing cars. Love writes, Terry assumed that Manson had meant to kill him. The guilt was devastating. Terry was haunted by those murders for the rest of his life. Dennis, I think, just wanted to lock away the whole episode in some deep recess of his soul, but as the years went by and his troubles with alcohol and drugs deepened, it was one more burden that he couldn't escape. Also in 1968, it emerged that Dennis had been having an affair with Mike Love's wife, Suzanne Belcher. Love writes, the worst part of Suzanne's affair with Dennis wasn't even the affair. Terry Melcher later told me that after we separated, Suzanne and Dennis would sometimes go out and leave our 2 young children with a babysitter. On one occasion, the babysitter was Manson disciple Susan Atkins. I never sought confirmation from Suzanne or Dennis, but Terry was one of the most trustworthy people I knew, and he would not have fabricated such a story. Atkins used Sharon Tate's blood to write pig on the outside of the front door. She was convicted of participating in 8 murders and was sentenced to death, and she was our babysitter. He continues, the breathless coverage of the murders cast Southern California as a breeding ground for sadism, criminality, and freaked out hippies. This made a mockery of the Southern California we had glorified and reinforced the perception that the Beach Boys were impossibly detached from what was happening in our country. Capitol Records did not renew our contract in 1969. For the first time in 7 years, we didn't have a label. Financially, we had little money coming in. We were still reeling from our tour-related losses and were behind on many of our bills. The Beach Boys did come back though, and they had plenty of success in the late 70s and onwards. Even 55 years later, the murders at Cielo Drive continue to disturb and shock. It's a tragic story, made all the more strange by the Manson family's links to Dennis Wilson and the Beach Boys. Dennis died in 1983 on December the 28th, 3 weeks after his 39th birthday. He drowned at Marina del Rey after drinking all day and then diving in the afternoon to recover his ex-wife's belongings previously thrown overboard at the marina from his yacht 3 years earlier amidst their divorce.